Welcome everyone. My name is David Talby. I'm the CEO at Johnson Labs and Pacific AI. And today I want to talk to you about testing clinical LLMs for cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are something that you learn a lot about if you go to medical school because they have a very big impact on how you practice medicine and what you need to be careful of. So we are talking about cases where you can see an example here. There's a clinical case, and first of all, as a clinician, you have to knowledge about, okay, what to do if you have a 52-year-old coming in with chest pain and certain vital signs, certain history. Cognitive bias happens when I do not change the clinical facts, but I kind of reframe it. For example, patient has a history of anxiety, it's probably a panic attack, which is a framing. And as a clinician, you should know that it should not change the fact that if someone is coming in with chest pain, you should test them for, for example, for a heart attack, right? For, you should call for an ECG, do other things. What happens in practice, of course, is that those cognitive biases are very hard for humans to ignore. And then that's what we need to test for. Here we are talking about LLMs. Those issues and errors reproduce and even grow worse with the LLMs. So what we'll talk about, what kind of cognitive biases you should look for, how would testing benchmark look like, and then how would you use it in practice on a daily basis. So there are 4 parts to this presentation. We're going to start with talking about what cognitive biases are within the context of LLM testing. So medical cognitive biases drive most of the errors that human doctors make when diagnosing patients. And you can see here there's a whole literature about 3/4 of the diagnostic errors in internal medicine attributed to cognitive biases. Almost all of the mistakes that happen in the emergency room are attributed to clinical cognitive biases. And a more recent study found that more than 3 separate cognitive biases are involved in physician-reported errors. So as you can see, the problem is that clinicians, they know the material. They know what needs to happen, but because they are human, very often they make those mistakes. Very different kind of mistakes that we'll talk through today. The effects, not anecdotal, the effects of cognitive biases have been studied in medicine honestly for 200 years and are very well documented as clinical trials, right, and as well-done studies in medicine. So for example, availability bias, it's a bias that reports the fact that residents very often diagnose similarly to the last case they've seen. So if I just had someone and they had a heart attack, I see the next person, I'm much more likely to think they have a heart attack than they should, because traumatic memorable events, like what happens in healthcare, we tend to reproduce them. Patient effect, doctors treat you differently if you come in and you're very angry, if you're very difficult. They will also treat you differently if you're very stoic about it. Listen, I've had this pain since last week, and my wife told me to come. I really think it's nothing. They're much likely to release you, even though they shouldn't. We'll talk about framing effect, but framing is basically the fact that if I tell you, 2 out of 10 people who do this surgery die, you're very unlikely to do the surgery. If I tell you, look, 80% who do the surgery live, you're much more likely to do it, even though I'm telling you the exact same statistic. I just frame it differently. This has a very big effect on both doctors and patients. Base rate neglect is basically forgetting statistics when it counts. One study that gave a physician the base rate, the prior probability, the sensitivity, and the false positive rate on mammography, and then they asked the doctors, if a woman has a positive finding in mammography, what's the likelihood she actually has breast cancer? And doctors said, well, we think it's about 75%. The true number is about 7.7%. Okay, so the doctors were wrong by an order of magnitude, right? But like 10x wrong, because they forgot the fact that the prior probability that any woman will have breast cancer is 1%. So those are the kind of things that we have papers behind that we've studied in medicine. And what we have found over the last couple of years is that large language models have inherited this whole suite of different cognitive biases that we know about. The most well-studied example here is a benchmark called BiasMedQA, which basically is based on adding this kind of social cues within USMLE questions. You can see in the graph what it found. It found that basically accuracy dropped between 10 to 26% across 6 frontier models at the time they tested it. Another interesting finding is that the impact of cognitive biases is on accuracy of large language model is 3 times as bad as the impact, for example, of demographic bias. So we know that large language models have a problem with demographic bias, right? So bias based on race or ethnicity, on gender, on socioeconomic status, on your insurance status. There's biases on linguistic, so how well people speak English, basically, versus how the model reads it. There's emotional bias, what emotion you use when you talk to the LLM. What we are talking about today has 3 times the impact on validity, clinical accuracy as all of those aspects. So while this is definitely less studies in the LLM space, it is hugely important when you want to put systems in production, like to see if you trust. Another very important point is that the things we usually assume would kind of solve these problems do not solve them. For example, papers beyond each of these claims. Scale, meaning making the LLM bigger, right? So, if you just add more parameter, make the LLM bigger, use the frontier models, not only does it not help, it actually makes some of these cognitive biases worse. And there are papers that look at things like sycophancy, handling social pressure, confirmation bias, because really, like for example, when Claude released Opus 4.8, they said, oh, we optimized it for instruction following. Okay, instruction following is literally anchoring bias and confirmation bias, right? Is if I hinted you it's something, you should take my hint and go with it. Okay, and as a result, when you run these really on the larger newer frontier models, you actually see they perform worse in terms of giving you really worse clinical outcomes on some of those benchmarks. RLHF basically it rewards agreement. That is how reinforcement learning works, right? Kind of, I literally give you an incentive when you agree with me, which means that there's less incentive for the model to go and correct you when that needs to happen. And you see that impact in scores. The other thing, prompting does not close this gap. So if you prompt people specifically, come and say, look, I'm going to ask you now about the basic neglect bias. Here's what it means. Here you should be careful of it. Now here's my question. It still does not solve it. It addresses it to some extent, but once you get into the clinical note, it does not solve it at all. And the other problem is that you cannot prompt for everything. Some problem with cognitive biases is there's the cue that tells you there is a bias. Said, oh, the chief resident says it's probably, GRED, you don't need to test for this thing, is in the note itself. Okay, so the problem that the input that you send to the LLM is kind of already the prompt that you don't want to have. And we also have a recent use that said that reasoning models do not solve it either. Basically, whether you use a reasoning model or kind of a traditional LLM had no impact on whether these vulnerabilities exist or become better. Which means that what you can do is you need to test for these things, right? So you know exactly where you have issues, and then you can see how you address this. So one thing before we get into the next section is, what is a cognitive bias? So we define a clinical cognitive bias as a systematic change in the model's clinical output produced by a change in the framing of a case, where the clinical facts and the correct answer are unchanged. Okay, so we are specifically looking for a fact where the only thing we change is how we frame a case, where the actual clinical facts and, most importantly, the actual correct answer are not changed. This means that we do not, for example, generate test cases here. We have clinicians review them, because sometimes you can add a cue which actually does make a change, right? So for example, if we tell you that the patient is pregnant, it absolutely matters. It absolutely changes kind of the correct clinical answer if they complain about bleeding, right, or stomach pain. Okay, if we tell you that the patient has a history of schizophrenia, then it absolutely means that if they have chest pain, it is more likely to be a panic attack than other things. So you should at least order the test in a different way. So what we are looking for, and that's partly kind of how we build the test suite, partly how we had real practicing clinicians review them, we are looking to build cases where, and we define a bias, right, as a case where what we only change is the framing, but the clinical facts and, more importantly, what you need to do about them clinically does not change. Also, when we talk about measuring cognitive biases, we need to make sure that we don't conflate it with other things, right? Because, one of really the main challenge of testing and statistics in general is, are you testing the right thing? And when you give me a metric or a measure, does it actually do what you think it does, what it says it does? So for example, one of the things we need is we need to separate the cognitive biases from accuracy. Because if we go back, for example, to the first example we looked at, here, the one on the left, 52-year-old with chest pain, vital signs, history exam document. We have the full documentation. What should you do? If you get that one wrong, okay, then it doesn't matter if you get the one with with cognitive bias still wrong, okay, because it just means you don't know the answers, right? So when we look at testing this, we can say, first of all, we want to see if you know the correct answer. If you don't know it, that's an accuracy issue. If you do know it, but you change your answer with the social cue that we give you, that is a cognitive bias. A second thing we do not test are demographic biases. Okay, so demographic bias basically fairness, right? Do you treat men and women the same way? Do you treat white people and black people the same way? Jews and Christians the same way? Do you mistreat, discriminate against new immigrants, old people, pretty people, rich people? Those are all demographic biases. Obviously, we test them within Pacific AI, just it's a completely different test suite. It's very different than cognitive biases. Okay, so we just make sure we don't conflate them. And sycophancy also specifically is tested differently, because you have to do a multi-turn test to establish that. So just methodologically, we make sure cognitive biases, because it is its own thing, it's its own type of risk, it's its own type of harm, we make sure it basically becomes one of the test suite that you are responsible for testing, for monitoring, for an AI model, an AI system, separately from things like accuracy, demographic harm, reliability, other ones. And the last point to make on this section is that you actually have to do this. First of all, you have to do this morally, because clinical cognitive biases kill people. They'll kill people every day. You come to the ER, and because of certain history, because someone made a mistake, because we are too calm or too angry, someone doesn't check the right things, doesn't give you the right medication, doesn't order the right radiology, they send you home instead of leaving you there, they give you the wrong treatment, and people die. So, when you study medicine, clinical cognitive biases is one of the main things you study in terms of patient safety. Okay, the issue is, yes, you know the material, you know how to treat the patients. When we make mistakes as clinician, it's not because we didn't know, it's because we didn't know what the book says, okay, for social reasons. Okay, because all of these biases have impacted us day to day, because we are humans treating humans. When you have an AI system, you can see there's a whole suite of laws, regulations, industry standard that actually require you to do this, require you to test for this. If you don't want to test it because it's the right thing to do, test it because it's the law, or test it because, if your system provably fails on this, you can rightfully get sued for violating the law. So we've done with all of this at Pacific AI, because our goal with Pacific AI is to enable you to deploy safely, legally, AI systems that actually work. We've built 17 benchmarks, but what we want to talk about here is first what they are, but then also about why and how we build them. So the way we went about it is not just, okay, let's find some, there's confirmation bias, there's basic neglect, let's build those. We went about it in a more systematic way. We did a thorough literature review of the medical literature to find out really what non-biases are there. The criteria for us was that the bias has to be clinically documented, known to have a real impact on patient safety, okay, and then, of course, also measurable by LLM. For example, if the fact that I look at someone and I don't like their face, and I do something differently, that happens in real life, but that's not something that you can test in LLM that only takes in text. No one writes in a lot, patient is particularly pretty or particularly ugly, and see the impact of that. So we look at things that can be tested. We deduplicated things. We make sure that everything we do is actually backed by science and by facts. And we built benchmarks for 2 tasks. One of them is clinical decision making. So look at how different cognitive bias impact all the example we just looked at, which is how do you make the right clinical decision, how to diagnose, what to test for next, what is the next best action. 5 of them are specifically for clinical coding. Okay, so cognitive biases do not impact only clinical decision making, also all the other decision making in healthcare. Specifically, so far we cover clinical decision making and clinical coding. And we'll talk about why we build 385 cases for each of those biases, and how we build them so that you do not require an LLM as a judge, and the advantages of that. So for clinical decision making, without further ado, here are the 12 cognitive biases that we have decided after the literature review, after the integration, the team of clinicians, lawyers, data scientists work together. We decided that those are the 12 we want to test for. Each one of them has its own separate test benchmark, meaning that we can give you your pass rate or your success rate, a number between 0 and 1, on each of those 12 separately, and we'll also talk about how we can give you results about subgroups within each one of those with a confidence interval. And the 12 are anchoring, an early impression holds after the evidence moves in, a confirmation bias, meaning that if there is a working diagnosis, as humans we tend to stay with it. Premature closure, once we have a diagnosis, basically the thinking stops. So we diagnose the patient 2 days later. If we see that actually the diagnosis is wrong, it's extremely hard to change a decision that was already made. That's what premature closure is about. We talked about availability bias. We spoke about framing. Frequency is the case where basically the most common diagnosis wins, right? Most of the patients we see with those symptoms have this, therefore this patient also has this. Order effect basically means that the order in which finding appears in the note, in the order caused my decision, right? Because as you tell me things, I'm already thinking. So if you tell me things, clinical facts in the wrong order, I'm going to change my decision. And then specifically things, what we're kind of proud of is the column of the right, because those are tests that really we have not seen studied with the LLM literature so far. One of them is social pressure. Talk a bit more about that. Therapeutic inertia. So the fact that humans do not tend to intensify or change the course of treatment if the patient is failing to improve with the course that's already there. And defensive medicine. Defensive medicine is the very prevalent case where doctors do things because they don't want to get sued, not because it's the right thing for the patient. And there are specific peer-reviewed guidelines for that we can test against. So here are some examples. Anchoring is really the case where here on the left, we have the baseline arm, kind of the clinical facts, discomfort for 2 hours, diaphoresis, discomfort in the jaw, non-specific ECG changes. And then we ask the model, okay, what would you do in this case? And then we add one more sentence. Triage note, likely GERD flare, documented reflux history, report similar past episodes. Okay, anchoring means that basically something that happened in the past that basically anchors the current diagnosis. Okay, then we come and say, yes, look, here are all the clinical facts, but because of something that's usually irrelevant, we think it's something else. So that is what anchoring is. Of course, the trick was to find 385 different clinical examples of where this happens. Framing is basically presenting the same statistics in 2 different ways. A treatment under which 90 out of 100 patients survive the first year versus a treatment under which 10 out of 100 patients die in the first year. If you use the word die in front of a patient, they're very unlikely to do the surgery. So basically, as a doctor, you can heavily influence whether you want the patient to do the surgery or not by really which of the 2 sentences you use to tell them the exact same number. The interesting thing is that this framing not only impacts patient, it also impacts doctors the same way. Although, of course, if you see those 2 kinds of things, you can say, look, you should really not be able to change the actual clinical recommendation based on this, and any change means that you're probably doing the wrong thing, right, scientifically. Defensive medicine is interesting because it's so widely used. So in the US, 93% of high liability specialists reported practicing defensively. And this is probably an undercounting because this is people, when you ask them, okay, do you sometimes order tests for the patients even when it's not needed so that they don't sue you? And you say yes. As you can imagine, as a specialist, you actually have a big incentive to lie and say that no, everything is okay. But still, 93% of people say they do it. So it's a very, very prevalent thing. And the point is that this is actually harmful to patients. So when we send people to do a radiology they don't need, we put radiation in their body and people develop cancer and die. This is a very well-known fact that it happens. So the problem with defensive medicine is that when we overtreat people, we harm them. And we harm them in very peer-reviewed, concrete ways that do happen. As a result, there are several campaigns, several coalitions of doctors that wrote specific rules. The most well-known is what's called the Choosing Wisely. There's a Choosing Wisely campaign that set up specific rules that said, for example, if someone coming in with lower back pain and no other symptoms, no, you should probably not do an X-ray or CT scan, right? If someone bumped their head, you should not do a head MRI, unless, right, there are other symptoms and so on, because you're more likely to harm them than help them if you do. And the trick with defensive medicine is to know, look, sometimes you do want to do things, even where there's low probability, because if you don't, you can miss something critical. But it's called defensive medicine becomes a no. This extra intervention you're looking is more likely to cause harm than help. And this is something that LLMs tend to do because LLMs are often, they're actually trained to be more defensive, and they're often trained based on what people do on a day-to-day basis. Therapeutic inertia is another kind of also very well documented bias in real medicine, and that is the failure to initiate or intensify therapy when you need it. Okay, so for example, I am managing my diabetes, you give me metformin, you give me something, I'm still not in the range, right? Still my H1C is too high. After we meet after 3 months, after 6 months, what you need to do is you need to increase the medication, right? You need to intensify the therapy. If you don't do it, you've conducted therapeutic inertia, which means that you let a sick person remain sick and you're not helping them the way you should help them get better. And cognitive biases, this is something the doctors do very often, because not doing it means that you have to admit you were wrong, right? You have to admit that what you did for the patient is not actually helping them. You have to do something that may be harder for the patient to do, right? You're going to give them more medication, we'll have more side effects, right? And more other things. That's another thing we need to test. 2 of the 12 biases report 5 different cases. For social pressure, we have 5 separate sources. So one is the patient thinks they know what they have already. Okay, so a patient comes to you, listen, I have the symptoms, I know what I have. It's like, can we just do that and see whether you actually are able to resist that? A senior clinician, right? The department head reviewed the chart and thinks it's this. You are much more likely as a clinician to agree with them than to fight with them, or even just come say, well, I still want to order all the tests, right? You're going to get something like, why? It's like the department head looked at it. It's like, why are you ordering all of these expensive tests? And you need to be able to withstand that. Your own peers is a different thing. Practice norm. Look, this is how we do in all these cases. Why change? And the 5th one that we added was a machine, so automation bias. Okay, we have this clinical decision support tool. It says it's this. What do you think? Okay, and this is literally one of the first time people actually test for automation bias within a test suite. So now we have that. The certain kind of cognitive bias test that also have 5 registers is patient affect, patient emotion, angry patients, assertive patients, right? So patient comes, like for example, a kid comes with the mother knows what, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, I want you to do this. Highly anxious patients, depressed patients, okay, but don't talk, don't care. It's like, I'm beyond help. Patients who minimize what they have. Okay, well, it's probably nothing, but maybe you should look. So what we've done with those 12 cases we've just seen, we've actually rebuilt the test suite. That's a collaboration between data scientists and clinicians. Because, for example, if we look here at the therapeutic inertia, what we needed is to come up with 385 clinically distinct and separate cases of where this happens. Okay, what you don't do, you don't take 30 cases and duplicate them, okay, or change them, right? They actually have to be different specialties, different clinical cases. Otherwise, there is no validity to the number report. There's no confidence interval. But on top of that, beyond those 12, we also built 5 cases for cognitive biases in clinical coding. Okay, and what's important to know, there's one dimension in cognitive bias is okay, what is the bias, right? And make sure that that works well. But another completely different one is what action, what task you ask the LLM to do. And so far, all we spoke about was clinical decision making, right? How would you diagnose what's the next best action to the patient? Clinical coding is a completely different task. Clinical coding is, here's a note, now turn it into a bill, right? What's the correct billing code? And as you can see, like for example, okay, social pressure does not apply there, right? I'm a clinical coder. I'm 3 weeks later, I'm in a different room. It does not change the billable code. However, when you look at the literature, when you look at the task of clinical coding, other cognitive biases that apply in clinical coding. So if you want to claim that you have an automated clinical coding tool, those are things that you should test, and in some cases you are legally required to test. Those are completely separate than do you return the accurate code, right? That's accuracy. So completely separate than do you bill, white people, black people, right? New immigrants, all the immigrants the same way. It's a completely separate type of harm that needs to be tested. So what we did, because clinical coding is a very popular task for LLM, it has direct financial exposure and direct legal exposure to whether you're a health system, you repair, right? You're kind of in the coding business. What we found and what we decided we are going to focus on are 5 coding integrity benchmarks. For 5 also known documented cases that impact real coders, real clinical coders in practice is a known thing, and of course that LLMs are susceptible to as well. And the 5 are assertion over documentation. Okay, that's the case where, for example, if you look at the reader does not actually have the clinical evidence that the patient has this, and then just the attending physician just wrote in the note, I am diagnosing the patient with this. Okay, please code this. This is what the patient has. Although if you read the rest of the, the vitals, everything there, it just does not substantiate it. So assertion over documentation. Second is principal diagnosis anchoring. Okay, they say, look, we think the patient has this. Okay, they have a chest pain. We decided that, they have myocardial infarction. We just go with it. Even though later, they stay in hospital 4 days later, we found that they actually had something else, right? Or maybe something else. It's primary or secondary. Third one is common code default. People says, look, most patients do have this. We just code it under this, just code it under this. You miss specificity of codes. Sometimes you miss the categories themselves. Copy forward. What happens in a lot of progress notes today is that only 15 to 20% of the text actually new. A lot of it is copy pasted. The reason it's copy pasted is because the rule says, look, you can only code a note. So people say, okay, no problem. Look, I'll just keep forwarding everything. So we have this very long note where a lot of things are copy pasted. Some of the things that are copy pasted because they are copy pasted from days or weeks earlier will no longer be true. We thought the patient had this, now we did this radiology, now we think they have something else. Okay, there's still a statement that says, yes, the doctor diagnosed the patient with X, but it's just no longer the case. And number 5 is kind of relative for it, position sensitivity, which is basically where something appears in the note will change how the coder codes it. So those are 5 out of the 12 that we found that are literature backed and absolutely happen in clinical coding and have to be tested, and we build those as well. So those are now 17 benchmarks that you have within Pacific AI that cover the kind of the entire known literature of clinical cognitive biases, also as a separate thing from all the other test suite that we have and you should test. Now, the next thing I want to cover is statistical design, which is how we build those stats and what makes them statistically valid. In general, the challenge with testing and statistical testing is what you don't want is you want to come and say, oh, anchoring, good point. We should have some clinicians, sit, write 100, 200, 500 examples, and then we run them and we get a number, and, if the number is better, then the LLM is better. That does not answer the very basic question of, is my model, is it good enough? Is it ready? If I get one LLM got 82, one got 75, is the one actually better? Kind of what is the confidence interval? When should I raise an alert, right? So let's say I have drift in production, the drift is 3 points. 3 points, a lot or a little, right? That does not work. And our goal here was to design a benchmark that's going to be statistically valid that would answer those questions. And so it needs to be balanced, it needs to have confidence intervals, it needs to not have duplicates, and this is what we're going to talk about now. So first of all, the way the test runs, we have a baseline arm and a perturbed arm. So the perturbed arm is the one that has the social cue, that extra sentence that we had, depending on the cognitive bias we are testing. We give it to the model. We ask the model to return a very fixed decision. So not an explanation, but a very, very fixed decision, so that later we can compare the two answers just with string comparisons without an LLM as a judge, because LLM as a judge is its own biases, and that's the comparison. So the model under test gets the baseline arm and gets a perturbed arm. If it fails the baseline arm, we assume it's an accuracy issue. It's like, don't move on. If you get the accuracy correct, we see if you got the same results under the perturbed arm, and then we can run the comparison. For reference, the reason it is that way is because this is precisely how the tests for cognitive biases were done on humans. Okay, so basically we're doing this the same way the clinical literature is designed or says when human doctors are being tested, we just replace, instead of human sitting in the chair, now we have an LLM sitting in the chair. But we follow kind of the same guidance. One important thing is that, of course, the Q must not change the correct answer. Okay, and this is why we have clinician reviews. For example, there are many well-known cases in medicine, but for example, chest pain presents differently with men and women. Pain, heart attacks present differently. So if you change the gender on the same symptoms, that actually matters quite a lot. Sometimes presenting the patient history actually does matter. Okay, sometimes you say, look, it's just anchoring, and a clinician can say, look, I understand this is anchoring, it should not change what test you should order right now. sometimes clinicians say, oh, you give me this patient history, oh, it absolutely changes what I'm going to do next. Okay, and this is why we need clinicians to confirm that the Q does not change the correct answer clinically. As I say, we separate bias from missing knowledge, right? So if you don't pass the first one, you give me the correct answer on the base, then we don't even test, right? Whether you perturb one, right? And this is because we want to separate measurement of accuracy from the measurement of cognitive biases. The choice of 385 match pairs for each benchmark is not accidental. It enables us to provide an answer within plus minus 5-point confidence interval. And this is kind of the statistic, and actually, usually the confidence interval is better than plus minus 5 points. You can see the statistic, really, it's 385, assume the worst case, where p equals 1/2. What it means that when you run these tests and we tell you, oh, on anchoring, you do, your score is 82, it means it's between 77 and 80 and 87. You have that confidence interval, which enables you to know, when really you have drift. It enables you to know when a model is better than another model, right? So if one model did 83, another did 81, or we actually do not know which model is better, right? Because it's within the same confidence interval. The other thing this meant was we had to make sure that those 385 are clinically distinct. So for example, CARES 18K is one of the popular safety data sets. And they talk about the fact that, yes, they have 18,000 examples, but when you read the paper, no, they actually have a third of that. They actually have something like, I think it's around 6,700 examples that are actually clinically different. And then they replicated them. Replicated means, look, it's the same clinical case, it's just described differently. Okay, so you just kind of write the same story in different orders, use different words, right? So it looks different, but it's the same clinical case. And it's okay because to test robustness that way, right? And kind of ask the same question 3 ways, it is helpful. But it means that if you're looking to have a confidence interval, actually the only number that matters is how many clinically distinct cases you have. Okay, because if you have a smaller number and you just duplicate them, you just don't get that statistical property that we're looking for here, which basically means we put a whole lot of work clinically to study across specialties, right, and really try to find anchoring cases, confirmation cases, baseline neglect cases across specialties to have that coverage. The second thing we did was make sure that the case is balanced. So we balance each specific benchmark across 9 medical specialties, across 7 care settings, so inpatient, outpatient, telehealth, right, urgent care, and so on. 3 age bands, so pediatric, adult, and senior, with senior being the most represented because that's a reality. We also make sure that we balance the different cases across comorbidity load, so how many comorbidities the patient has, how complex is the case, so between light, medium, and complex cases, acuity, right, acute, not acute, and things like race and ethnicity, insurance and demographic status, and primary language. So basically, we took all of these dimensions and make sure patients are balanced among them. And then we did quarter-based sampling. And this, of course, an iterative process until you can actually check that all of your patients, all your processes are balanced to make sure you actually represent all of these dimensions in an accurate way. The reason you need to pruning, because of course some combinations do not work. You do not have men going into obstetrics, right? You do not have children being pregnant and so on. So not everything is technically possible, but what you do balancing and then prune for the impossible cases. As I mean, the scoring is deterministic. Okay, so what we ask the LLM to return is to return basically a very, very specific decision. You can see how the string looks like, so that we can basically do a string comparison to see if the answer is correct or if the answer is the same. And you can see kind of the 5 benefits of that. When you don't have an LLM as a judge, it's cheaper to run, right? So you don't need to pay for an LLM as a judge. It's much faster. It's deterministic and stable over time, right? So you don't have a case where just a change in the judge changes your score. There's no grading conflict because LLM judges themselves are biased, and the results is always reproducible, right? So kind of once you called an LLM, you have what they answered. I can deterministically reproduce the same numbers every time, which, especially because when this is used for regulatory grade purposes, that's actually a legal requirement. The other important thing is we generated the test and we version it. So now we have the 2026 version. The next year we'll have the 2027 version. We do not make the datasets public. We make them available within Pacific AI, and you can run them within Pacific AI. You cannot download and use them, because once you download them, once you make the datasets public, and we'd love to be able to to open source or do all of that, But the problem is that once you do that, your test becomes invalid very, very quickly because of data contamination. Data contamination basically means that what people do, they take your test, they add it into the training set, and then they train it, and then they do fantastically on your test because they already have the questions, right? So basically, it's very different when you need to take a test when you know the questions in advance and when you don't know the question in advance. And you can see here on the left an example from the bias medQA set. So they did the whole work, they published the paper, and then they showed the difference between published and unpublished prompts. And the difference you see was between 47% to 86% on the published versus unpublished prompts. And this is especially prone with frontier models because the frontier models regularly scan the entire web. So if you put a data set on, Hugging Face or make it public, it is going into the next training set, the frontier model, and you're going to have this impact. Therefore, if you want to have a test that's actually usable for more than 2 weeks, you need to keep the data set private, offline, and that's the way we do it. But within Pacific AI also, you can just run the test as many times as you want without sharing your data with them. As I mentioned, the most important difference here is that we don't just go and generate test cases. We have clinicians review all the clinical ones. We have certified coders, AAPC certified coders review all the clinical coding biases. And we find all kinds of interesting things. Sometimes we generate something and clinicians say, no, I think this actually changes it. Sometimes they argue. When they argue, also we take it out, right? Because you want the test to be really focused on the cases that are non-ambiguous. But you do find funny things in those reviews. So we spoke about 3 things. We spoke about what are cognitive biases and really the fact that they are so important to the accuracy and performance of your LLM models. And as I said, they're more impactful in practice than things like demographic bias, emotion sycophancy. We talked about the 17 types of benchmarks that were built, and we spoke about the kind of what was the methodology and why we believe these are statistically valid in very specific ways. The last thing to talk about was really how you should use them. Basically, 2 things you need to do. One is within Pacific AI, you can use the gatekeeper basically to run them before every release. Okay, so basically, just as you have, unit test, right, for your user interface for, classic software application. Basically, if you have an LLM-based endpoint, so let's say you have an automated coding solution, you have a patient risk adjustment solution, you generate patient education materials, whatever your task would be, these are benchmarks you can add to a test suite system that you have within Pacific AI. You can give it your API endpoint, so any LLM endpoint or even a custom endpoint, right, if you build, say, a classifier or regressor. And then you should be running those tests basically before every release. Okay, so it can be integrated within your CI/CD pipeline, right? If you're using, Jenkins, Azure DevOps, right, GitHub Actions, all of those, we have those integrations. And the point is that before you ship something to production, you should have your passing tests for accuracy, for demographics bias, for reliability, and for cognitive biases. Okay, so that you know how your model behaves and you know that you actually fixed what needs to be fixed. The second thing you need to do is keep monitoring this in production, right? And this is what the Guardian component of Pacific AI does. It keeps running those tests just on a lower threshold in production so that there's no impact on your production capacity. You don't need more servers, all of that. But you do handle model drift. So that instead of testing, everything every hour, right? Because we have thousands and thousands of tests, we say, okay, we run, say, one test every 5 seconds, right? So the impact on traffic is negligible. But if we have a drift within a few hours, right, you will know. And this is critical to do because models do drift. And because also in many implementations today, for example, if you use a backend API provider, you use OpenRouter, if you use OpenAI, Claude, any of those APIs, they make changes behind the scene. And something like clinical cognitive biases is something you're going to miss. Because you can say, I switch from, GPT-5.5 to GPT-5.6. Oh, actually, accuracy is better, right? Actually, even some of the, demographic bias is better. You might miss the fact that, for example, your confirmation bias now is worse. Your anchoring bias is worse. If you don't test it, and really one thing you should know, and really it's the same as any type of software testing or data science testing, it's not one number. Right? You should be able to look at the whole model curve, the suite of numbers, and seeing how well you do, and then you make a decision, right? But one of the things that you get here is you get the ability, first of all, we build a test suite for you, and so we build them in a statistically valid way. They come with the product. You can test them before you go to production, and then you can also test them in production. And you can use the fact that you have confidence intervals to decide when you set alerts. Okay, so you said, okay, if you drop it by 2 points, honestly, it's within the confidence interval that could just happen. If it drops, okay, below 5 points, below 8 points, right, then send me an alert. Okay, and because we have balanced data sets, you can even test it for specific subgroups. So you can say, okay, I want anchoring bias for men and for women. Okay, and we can tell you exactly what is the confidence interval for all of those. Okay, so it's plus minus 5%, plus minus 7%, so that you can set the right alerts and know really when you have a problem in production. Okay, and all of that without writing any code. It's configuration only, it runs within your environment, right? So kind of just very easy to set up and accurately do. The last thing I would say is that really those bias findings are something that you can do something about. So there are mitigations. So I said prompting is a partial mitigation, not a complete one. Giving few short examples seems to also help somewhat. The other thing that helps them sometimes in reasoning models is what's called structured reflection. Where you tell someone, okay, do the diagnosis. It's like, okay, you're done. Then comes, okay, let's reflect. What was your thought process? And if you run it through that prompting, sometimes humans can self-correct. We do not have still evidence on how LLMs do that. But the point is that right now, they have the issue. You have the issue. You cannot expect what LLMs do naturally, which is basically grow bigger and use more reinforcement learning to fix it. There are other mitigations that basically you are legally and morally responsible to do. It is fairly cheap to do because now you have the benchmarks, you can run them, you can integrate them, pre-production. While you're in production, you can see when you have issue, right? And then really just close the loop. You see you have an issue, you put in together a mitigation, you can rerun the test and see if you solved it and deploy. And this could be, multiple times a day thing that you do. The key thing is that you actually do it. The third thing is an advantage you get within Pacific AI is that the evidence goes on the model card. So as you know, within Pacific AI, the only metrics get populated within the automated model card that we generate or we enable you to publish are metrics that come from tests you actually run, right? So you have that exact lineage of, yes, I ran this test of this version at this time, then what goes on the model card for that version. And any regulator that comes in, anyone that comes in later can reproduce it themselves, right, and make sure the model card actually reflects what actually happens for a version at a date. Then something that you can publish as well, Wilson interval, right, with even per arm breakdowns, right, if you want to report it separately per cognitive bias, per subgroup, per population, with confidence interval that's available to you as well. If you remember one thing from this presentation, this last line here, if you're building clinical AI, you're buying clinical, just ask the vendor. So, what happens when, I give you one question, and then the next question is, I just add a note that says, it's probably an anxiety attack, not a heart attack. If it hasn't been tested, you said that's your answer. So right now, if you look at the current way humans practice, the current way LLMs practice, this is a severe problem that has clinical consequences, financial consequences on the cognitive side, and also legal consequences. So really another thing that you're responsible to take care of. So if you want to try it within Pacific AI, as you say, you can just go and install it itself. It's a 10-minute install. Installs within your AWS or within your Azure account, within your environment. It's private, we never see it. By default, there's no platform fee. So, only if you start using the AI features, you need to pay anything. And it's cross-vendor, meaning you can test, any LLMs, any systems, including custom ones you've built yourself. So if you're interested to try this out, please do. If you're not ready for it, or if you have any other questions for me, please reach out and I'll be happy to discuss, learn from you, and help you the best I can. Thank you very much.